Canadian couple Bernardo and Karla Homolka appeared to be love's young dream. They appeared like a Barbie and Ken couple. It seemed like the ideal relationship, but they were far from a match made in heaven. The level of evilness with both these people was so extreme that they appeared animal-like and devoid of human emotions. The horror that drove this seemingly clean-cut couple to their appalling crimes had Karla Homolka raping, torturing right alongside her husband, and she seemed to be enjoying it. Were Bernardo and Homolka a couple born to kill? On the 29th of June, 1991, a discovery at Lake Gibson in Ontario would horrify the nation, and it would be a sickening chapter in a story that had begun 2 weeks earlier with the disappearance of a 14-year-old schoolgirl, Leslie Mahaffey. She was a typical teenage girl. A beautiful girl in every respect and a good student in school and came from a good family, had good values and was sweet and kind and generous. A really great kid who had her whole life in front of her, and on the 15th of June, Leslie had gone out with friends since she was living at home with her mother and stepfather in Burlington in a very nice middle-class neighborhood and had been told that if you're out with your friends and you miss your curfew, you'll be locked out of the house, a little bit of tough love going on. Leslie Mahaffey had a friend who had recently died and was a very popular kid, so Leslie was enjoying the times of remembering her friend, and before she realized it was already past her curfew. Of course, when she got home and the door was locked, she also realized that she had forgotten her key, and on all other occasions where she has forgotten her key, she would ring the doorbell, knock on the door, and Mom and Dad would answer the door and she'd have to account for missing her curfew. For some reason this time she chose not to do that, and shortly thereafter it became very clear that something was terribly wrong. A search began for the missing schoolgirl, but her disappearance baffled detectives when Leslie Mahaffey disappeared from her home in Burlington. The news absolutely shocked not just obviously those living in the neighborhood, but Canadians in general. 14 days later, a canoeist on nearby Lake Gibson would discover the appalling answer to Leslie's whereabouts. For one young couple, the 29th of June would be a far different experience. That very day, Bernardo and Karla Homolka were having a fairy tale wedding, and Karla had always thought of herself as a princess. She loved Disney characters, and she wanted to be a Disney princess, and she planned a wedding that certainly on its surface looked like something you could witness in Disneyland. 21-year-old Karla's Prince Charming was Bernardo, 5 years her senior but equally eager for a fantasy wedding. There was a rented coach, the old-fashioned coach, and there was pheasant under glass. There was a ball gown of a wedding dress that had the puffy princess sleeves. To onlookers, it was the dream marriage of a dream couple. It was like the Barbie and Ken couple, as they seemed like the ideal relationship, but the true story of Bernardo and Karla Homolka was no fairy tale. Both harbored deep, dark secrets that, once revealed, would send shock waves through civilized society. Karla Homolka's childhood has always been presented to us as more than average. Plus, she grew up in a small town. She had a mother and father whose marriage stayed intact, and Dad made a living primarily going to flea markets and selling lamps, and Mom was some sort of an administrative assistant at the hospital in St. Catharines. They had 3 daughters. They were well-liked in the community. The Homolka family had a swimming pool, so it was a gathering place for everybody, so she wasn't like an only child or someone who didn't have a family. She had a solid background. She was the oldest girl, blonde, blue-eyed, pretty vivacious, and spent a lot of time as a child playing Barbie dolls, but wasn't at all shy or weak, and she was naturally bright but not diligent when it came to her studies. She was very typical of young girls from small towns, but it appears pretty young. Karla may not have been all sweetness and light as Karla grew up, and I guess became the rambunctious teenager that many of us did. She went from being the very popular blonde always had a date, or at least a couple of guys who wished they had a date with her, to a darker phase at times. Karla's behavior struck friends as odd. Some of her friends called her bizarre because she was into the Ouija stuff and a little bit of the occult, and she seemed fascinated with death. She wore black, and she began to play in the area of the occult. One time, one of her friends said that her pet had died, and Karla was determined to go to the backyard and dig up the body. The body of this animal that had been buried in the backyard, she just had to see it. She and her friend finally did it, even though the friend didn't want to do it, but finally they did it. Karla just had this fascination with a dead pet. The teenaged Homolka would go on to work at a local vet, and it was during this time at a hotel attending a pet store conference in Toronto that she met the man of her dreams when she met Paul. It was like lust at first sight taking coffee in the hotel lounge. 17-year-old Karla was approached by 23-year-old trainee accountant Paul Bernardo, and there would be an instant and ultimately fatal attraction. It was a chance meeting, but to a certain extent it was precisely what Karla Homolka wanted. She was part of a high school club that prized the idea of getting married to someone wealthy, someone slightly older, and getting a big diamond engagement ring. So this was already her mindset. She could have had other guys, so she wasn't desperate, but she wanted him, for some reason. I think something in the two of them just felt right. It resonated. She was only 17, she was rather young, and Bernardo provided something for her that she was lacking. He came across as a strong individual in control, and she became obsessed with him. But there was far more to the ambitious young accountants than met the eye, and together Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka would become a deadly combination. In June 1991, while police searched for missing 14-year-old schoolgirl Leslie Mahaffey, they were enjoying a lavish, picture-perfect wedding. The seemingly dream couple had met 4 years earlier in the Toronto district of Scarborough. The year they met, the city would be rocked by an unprecedented series of violent rapes. The sexual assaults were the most brutal that I'd ever seen in my career at that time, and I served for 31 years on the Toronto Police Service. The mystery attacker would become known as the Scarborough Rapist, and there never was before, and never was, since such a string of attacks like that. People were scared stiff for a very long time as the terror would begin in 1987. It was in the late spring, and we had 2 sexual assaults very close to one another. Both victims were attacked on their own property. He attacked the women from behind, and they never really got to look at him at all. He threatened the victims that he would do harm to them if they made any noise. He scared them so they were afraid for their lives. If they screamed, he would kill them. Although they're attacked on their own property with family inside, they weren't able to call for help. The 2 assaults that spring were just the beginning. Over the next 3 years, the Scarborough Rapist would strike again and again, targeting lone women and teenagers and paralyzing the community. Several women were taking buses home at, late at night, and if you were a car following, it was easy to spot if there was a lone woman on the bus. Police flooded the area and created a dedicated task force, but the elusive rapist continued to strike. They couldn't figure out where he was going to attack next. Everybody was on guard, and yet the rapes continued. May to December 1987, 6 attacks. Some of the police officers, when their shifts were over, they were still cruising the area trying to find this guy, and they just couldn't get him. April and May 1988, 3 attacks. As he continued, he escalated in his violence, and some of the violence towards these victims was unspeakable. October to December 1988, 4 attacks. He would do awful things like gather up stones and sticks and insert them into the woman who had just been raped. June 89 to May 1995, more attacks. He took some of their belongings with them, which left them feeling more unsafe than they were in the first place. In a couple of cases, the women were just getting the courage to get up. He would re-emerge, throw them to the ground, and attack them all over again. The damage that it did to those victims was unreal. Law enforcement knew. It was only a matter of time before the unthinkable happened. When the FBI profilers actually were called in, they did say, if you don't get this guy, you can see from the way he's escalating, he will turn to murder. So there's no doubt that the fact that he wasn't getting arrested made him bolder. All the while, the Scarborough Rapist was terrorizing the city. Karla Homolka was being wooed and captivated by her new beau, Paul Bernardo, a seemingly impressive and charming young man with good prospects. He finished high school and went to university, and eventually found his way into the Chartered Accountants program and worked for my accounting firm. You look at him and you think that this guy is a professional, very confident, outgoing fellow who was very self-assured, didn't have any kind of doubts about his own ability. Paul Bernardo was everything Karla Homolka had ever dreamed of. Both as a child and as a teenager, he was older. Tall, blonde, he was handsome. She called him her prince. And he had a car, and he had a job, he ticked all her boxes. But Homolka's Mr. Perfect was not all he seemed. Paul Bernardo was born in 1964. A Scarborough native, he was troubled, it seems, from the very beginning. A voyeur who's a peeping Tom, and he wanted to be sexually inappropriate in a lot of ways. His parents were sleeping in separate rooms, and it was just a very unsettled life that he had at home. Despite the family turmoil on the surface, the young Bernardo seemed well-adjusted, joining the boys' scouts and later becoming a summer camp counselor. He was, fairly athletic. He was a lifeguard when he was younger. He also took karate lessons and, I'm very good-looking and he could get any girl he wanted, and he wasn't shy on ego at all. When Bernardo was 16 years old, his mother dropped a bombshell. The man he believed to be his biological father was not Paul. Bernardo had been the result of an extramarital affair. When Bernardo found out that he was a result of an extramarital relationship, he became rather angry, at his mother. She had referred to him as a bastard child, and I know that they had screaming matches. There's no question about that, and it wasn't a great family relationship. I don't think he identified with his stepfather very much. I think he really hated him. But there was one unhealthy interest the young Paul Bernardo had in common with his stepfather. He was caught several times as a peeping Tom trying to peer into the neighbors' windows, and parents often forbid their children from playing with him. As he grew older, Bernardo's sexual needs became increasingly sordid. He began to humiliate and beat girlfriends and engage in sadistic sex. Most rejected him, that is, until he met Karla. Karla's family life was pretty normal. There wasn't that much to say about it. But when she did meet Paul, she pretty quickly got into some of the deviance that he, the sexual deviant. She would write letters to him, saying, "Do what you want. To me, I'll do anything and everything." So she resonated to his deviance very fast. This has to tell you, this wasn't just she changed. And I'd have to say that there was already something there in her that he saw and triggered that she was quite ready for somebody like him. In 1990, after 3 years of terror for the city of Toronto, police got a break in their search for the Scarborough rapist for each of his 17 known assaults. He'd been careful to make sure his victims were unable to describe him, but in May, the elusive rapist let his guard down. He was brazen enough at that particular point to attack the female from the front. This was the first glimpse that we had, which helped us create a composite drawing to help us identify this particular individual after the composite picture was distributed. The police received a tip-off that the image bore a striking resemblance to a 25-year-old local accountant, Paul Bernardo. Detective John Monroe called Bernardo to the police station for questioning. I'll never forget this, as long as I live. He came into our office late in the afternoon. He was neat, clean. He wore a shirt and a tie. His hair was cut. He was very calm, cool, and collected. He looked like the all-Canadian boy, and I talked to him about different things, about any problems he'd had with women, and he said he never had any. Did he have a girlfriend now? And he said, "I do, my girlfriend's Karla Homolka." Of course, in November of 1990, the name Karla Homolka didn't mean anything to us because he had this sweet boy look, this cherubic look to him and charm. He also was gregarious, and he was able, as any good psychopath can be, to cover and charm people and make them believe that he's innocent. Bernardo was one of 700 persons of interest that the task force was looking into, and they'd already collected DNA samples from over 100 suspects. I asked Bernardo to provide samples of his hair and saliva and blood, and he gave them up right away by doing this. This is my opinion. He was trying to deflect any suspicion on himself by being so cooperative. Testing of the samples would eventually prove Bernardo was indeed the Scarborough rapist, but tragically not soon enough. At that time, DNA was in its infant stages in terms of being a forensic investigative tool, so the police took the sample and it sat for 2 years on a shelf. By 1990, Bernardo was spending lots of time with the Homolka family, but although he was now engaged to his willing girlfriend Karla, Bernardo was not satisfied as Paul had this thing for virgins, and Karla had boyfriends before Paul, and he liked women who had never had sex, as they were virgins, and he was kind of annoyed for him Karla's 15-year-old sister would provide the answer. Karla and Tammy looked like twins, except for the age difference. To Tammy, he was the big boyfriend, so she looked up to him, sort of idolized him. All of Paul's thought were only sexual for her, and he wanted to have sex with her. Paul Bernardo began pressuring Karla into arranging for him to take the virginity of her baby sister, and the most bizarre thing, and still impossible to comprehend, is that Karla did that 6 months before their planned wedding. Karla Homolka decided to gift her younger sister's virginity to her boyfriend for Christmas. The problem was that Karla was afraid that Tammy would tell, so Karla stole anesthesia from the vet's clinic where she worked, and the idea was to put Tammy under and then have a sexual assault, and that way they could have their threesome on the 29th of December 1990. With Karla's parents still in the house, they put their plan into action. The family was all gathered, and then everybody went to bed, except the 3 of them. So they had Tammy drinking and got her drunk, and as she passed out, they basically raped her in every possible way. Soon the unconscious 15-year-old began to turn blue, and Tammy vomited and suffocated, so they turned her upside down, because Homolka knew that from when she worked in the veterinary's office, but she actually died. They quickly thought of a cover story, they called emergency, and thought of a cover story, and that was accepted. It was all passed off as an accidental death, which it wasn't, of course. And Tammy was a gift, so it's hard and so painful as a parent to even think, how could somebody set up her own sister? Like, how does somebody do that? Tammy Homolka's unexpected death would not signal the end of Paul and Karla's deviant games. It would merely be the beginning of a sickening new chapter for Christmas of 1990. Karla Homolka had promised to gift her sister's virginity to her fiancé, Paul Bernardo. But as they drugged and raped 15-year-old Tammy, she choked to death, and while the Homolka family grieved the loss of the young schoolgirl, Karla and Paul continued preparations for their dream June wedding. They faked a lot of remorse, and both Paul and Karla wept, and Paul especially, about Tammy's death. But within a very short period of time, Karla was pressuring her parents to go ahead with the wedding, and she wrote to a friend how angry she was that her parents were taking so long months to get over Tammy's death because she wanted all of the attention back on her for her wedding. Bernardo and Homolka's lavish wedding day went ahead as planned on the 29th of June 1991, but unbeknown to onlookers, as the happy couple smiled and posed for photographers, they were hiding another dark secret. They held the answer to the riddle of missing teenager Leslie Mahaffey. 14-year-old Leslie had mysteriously disappeared from outside her home 2 weeks on nearby Lake Gibson, and a canoeist was about to discover her whereabouts. What he found would stun the nation. It wasn't just a question of shock. It was a question of horror. The water level was dropping down in Gibson Lake, and a fisherman found one, and then a passerby found another one encased in cement. Leslie Mahaffey's dismembered body parts. As some of the concrete wasn't solidified, it wasn't hardened, and it came apart, and one of the body parts drifted to the surface. Authorities then just dredged the lake, and they found the rest of her remains. Leslie's remains were found sewn up and encased in 8 concrete blocks, and the people of Ontario now realize they had a maniac in their midst. We're now dealing with someone who is demented, in the extreme psychopath, a serial killer. Because the Scarborough rapes had been going on, it just seemed like some new horror that the crime was escalating in this small, quiet, perfect little town. Leslie's fate had been sealed 2 weeks earlier before their wedding. Karla and Paul had moved into a rented house in St. Catharines, and this place is just a small, quiet Ontario community, which is accepted as being a very safe community, and obviously it wasn't. Paul Bernardo's twisted urges for young girls had not abated, and he talked to Karla about, "It'd be nice to bring somebody home and just so I could have them at my leisure for lack of the expression. He wanted to be able to have somebody where he wasn't attacking him outside and running. He wanted to have them as a slave in his house, and it would be 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey who paid the price for Bernardo's sick fantasies." On the night of the 15th of June, the schoolgirl had returned home late, forgetting her key, and unknown to her, Paul Bernardo was on the prowl. He seemed like a normal person, like all psychopaths. They have a charm to them, and they're remarkably successful in their manipulation, and he started up a conversation with her, and that resulted in her abduction and taken to the home in St. Catharines. When he brought Leslie home, it was weird. Karla was sleeping at the time, and she got up and he said, "Oh, here's this woman I've found." I think he had put a hood over her head or something, but Karla Homolka became enraged, apparently, not because there was a young woman that he planned to rape in the house, but because Paul had shared their wedding crystal flutes that you drink champagne out of, and he was sharing them with Leslie Mahaffey. Over the next 36 hours, Paul Bernardo assaulted his victim repeatedly, constantly instructing her to say specific degrading phrases. Bernardo engaged in scripting of his victims. He told his victims what to say. "Tell me how great I am. Tell me I'm the king," and so on. He is sexually aroused by degrading and humiliating his victims in a very extreme way, apparently. He had a difficult time even with the rapes keeping an erection, and the scripting helped because it was about humiliating these girls, saying things like, "Your boyfriend's not as good as I am," and much more vulgar things, which I won't repeat, but he wanted to degrade them as much as he possibly could and also elevate himself. He wanted them to say to him, "You know what? An amazing person he was." After he'd had his way with them, Leslie's young life was taken as he strangled her and then took the body in the basement, and Karla's parent came over for a Sunday dinner, and there's the body in the basement. This seems like one of the coldest things as Karla is going up and down into this cellar area, getting food with the body lying right there. The next day, Bernardo set up a plastic tent in the basement and plugged in a power saw as he went about hacking up the body, and he bought lots of bags of concrete from one of the local stores there and encased each body part in concrete and just threw them into the lake while driving over a little bridge and just threw them in. Despite public horror and a high-profile police investigation, Bernardo and Homolka didn't stop after Leslie was held, tortured, killed, and then decapitated. They went looking for another young victim, and this time the husband and wife would go hunting together. Kristen French was a remarkable, beautiful young girl, coming from a great family and was involved in school sports. She had a tremendous sense of humor as she had her whole life in front of her, and she was a very careful young woman. After Leslie's death, she was always telling other students, "Don't talk to strangers, and if you see a stranger, stay away." On the 16th of April, 1992, Bernardo and Homolka would commit their most brazen crime yet. Kristen is walking back from school in the afternoon. Broad daylight, she was walking home down a very quiet residential street, and she was in front of a church. This time, the married couple would operate in tandem all of a sudden. A car comes up, and you see Karla Homolka, who was an attractive young woman, and Karla was out with a map pretending she was lost, and that was the trap. Kristen, who's very careful, sees this young woman seemingly need help, so she went over to help her. As Kristen leaned over the map, Karla grabbed her. Paul came from around and grabbed her, and they pushed her into the car to the back seat, and they zoomed off to that same death house. They kept her for 3 days, approximately, and videotaped it. Just the brutality of it was gruesome, and the fact that they videotaped is the sadistic conduct that is quite common. That is what sexual sadists do, and they do it because they want to manufacture their own pornography, where he's really the star actor, and during her ordeal, Kristen saw an opportunity to escape her tormentor. Paul went out for food during the 3 days of captivity. Kristen was quite bright. She's She said she wanted food from the farthest outlet in St. Catharines, so she knew Paul would be gone for a half hour, so basically Karla was alone with Kristen French for like a half hour. Kristen was pleading with her, and Karla wouldn't let her go. She knew that they had to kill her, and she knew that this poor girl was going to be dead in a matter of days or whatever, and had she just picked up the phone and dialed 911, it would have saved her life. From here on, things started to go downhill for the couple. Paul began to beat Karla up, and she basically left him as the assault would spell the beginning of the end for the killers. It wasn't until Karla Homolka went screaming to police about the fact that she'd been beaten up by Paul Bernardo that the case began to crack while Homolka pressed charges against her husband for assault. The DNA samples that the Scarborough Rape Task Force had on Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, and the death of her sister Tammy, but claimed that she'd been a battered wife and an unwilling accomplice with little evidence against Bernardo for the murders. Prosecutors felt they needed a witness to convict him. The only way to put Paul Bernardo in prison was to believe Karla Homolka's story. Homolka was offered a deal to testify against her husband and receive a total of just 12 years in prison. But before the trial began, a discovery was made that would show the shocking home video cassettes that had Karla's handwriting describing the horror of the rapes and killings of Kristen and Leslie. It was written Paul and me with hearts and flowers like little stickers, and what we all discovered is that there was Karla Homolka raping, torturing these young girls right alongside her husband Paul, and she seemed to be enjoying it. The attorney for the victims' families, Tim Danson, would be required to view the grim home movies, and it was a pretty awful thing to witness. Paul, without any remorse at all, the public would speculate that Bernardo, as the Scarborough rapist, had not killed before he met Homolka and question if she had been the motivating force for murder. What was certain, however, was that together, Bernardo and Homolka were a deadly duo. But were they born killers, or had their upbringings made them monsters? Nature versus nurture is a puzzling question in the case of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. Paul, as a young kid, had been told he was illegitimate and his upbringing was far from perfect. Then he happened to meet somebody who facilitated those feelings. So even if Bernardo and Homolka had never met, might each of them have been destined to become murderers, there were people who said, well, if Karla had never met Paul, she would have never become a killer. I'm not sure that's true, as she probably wouldn't have been a killer, but she would have been a calculating and manipulative person. There's no doubt about that. Very narcissistic, very sad. The rest of his life, Paul will be behind bars, as now one half of this deadly duo now walks the streets free. One thing that was clear when you look at these videotapes is that the level of evilness and the level of horror with both these people is so extreme that there is not 1 ounce of being human, as these people were animals. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this crime story. We have many more crime and mysteries, suspenseful betrayal, and more evilness and strange and horrific stories to tell.